The first time I saw the airplane touching down on my property, I honestly thought I was hallucinating. I slammed on the brakes, stepped out of my truck, and watched a small aircraft roll across what had been my soybean field just a few months earlier. The pilot waved like nothing was wrong. Several people stood nearby taking pictures. Others cheered as if they were attending some kind of community event. What none of them knew was that the land beneath that airplane belonged to me. And what the AA president definitely did not know was that my day job involved aviation regulations at the highest level. By the time he realized whose property he had built his runway on, emergency meetings were being scheduled, lawyers were making frantic phone calls, and one of the most unbelievable HOA disasters our county had ever seen was already unfolding. Before we get into this story, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Karen Stories Daily for more HOA drama entitled Neighbor Stories and Unbelievable Real-Life Conflicts. My name is Daniel, and my family had owned the farm for nearly 3 generations. The property sat just outside a rapidly growing residential community. For decades, we raised crops, maintained equipment, and stayed out of everyone else's business. Life was peaceful until a large HOA development expanded toward the edge of my land. At first, the relationship was fine. The new residents seemed friendly. Most respected the property boundaries. And aside from occasional complaints about farm equipment noise, we rarely had problems. The biggest exception was the HOA president. His name was Richard. Richard loved attention, he loved projects, and he seemed determined to leave some kind of legacy behind. Whenever community improvements were discussed, Richard wanted something bigger than everyone else. A larger clubhouse, a larger entrance, a larger recreation area. Nothing ever seemed ambitious enough for him. Over time, rumors began spreading about his newest idea. According to several residents, Richard wanted to create a private airstrip for aviation enthusiasts living in the community. Most people assumed it was just another unrealistic proposal. I certainly did. After all, building an airstrip requires approvals, planning, surveys, and significant regulatory review. No reasonable person would attempt something like that without proper authorization. At least that was what I believed. Several months later, I started noticing unusual activity near the rear section of my farm. Construction vehicles appeared. Survey markers showed up. Heavy equipment operated near areas that rarely saw traffic. At first, I assumed nearby developers were working on their own property. The activity seemed far enough away that I paid little attention. Then one morning, a neighboring farmer called me. He sounded confused. He asked why contractors were clearing part of my field. I immediately drove to the tank location. What I found made no sense. A long section of land had been graded and flattened. Construction crews were actively working. Large equipment moved back and forth across ground that absolutely belonged to me. When I demanded answers, several workers confidently informed me they were building a community aviation project authorized by the HOA. I asked who had given permission to use my property. The workers exchanged confused looks. One eventually pointed toward a project manager. The conversation that followed only raised more questions. According to the manager, the HOA had assured everyone that land access issues had been resolved months earlier. They claimed all necessary approvals were in place. They claimed property concerns had already been addressed. Most importantly, they claimed the project had full authorization. I knew that was impossible. Because nobody had ever contacted me. Nobody had requested access. Nobody had discussed easements. Nobody had asked for permission. And I was absolutely certain that no document existed giving the HOA the right to touch my farm. That was when I decided to find out exactly what Richard had been telling people. What I discovered over the following weeks would leave the entire community speechless. Yeah. Part 2, Hi. Over the next several weeks, I gathered every document I could find. Property maps, survey records, county filings, construction permits. I wanted to understand how a project this large had somehow ended up crossing directly onto my farm. The answer was unbelievable. The HOA had relied on an outdated map that incorrectly showed part of my property as unused land connected to a development area. Instead of verifying ownership through proper channels, Richard pushed the project forward, based on assumptions. Those assumptions became expensive mistakes. The deeper I investigated, the worse the situation became. Construction crews had already spent months preparing the site. Equipment had crossed property boundaries repeatedly. Large portions of farmland had been altered. Money had been invested. Contracts had been signed. And all of it was built on a foundation that never should have existed. When I formally notified the HOA that the runway crossed private property, Richard reacted exactly as many residents expected. He denied everything. He claimed the project was properly approved. He claimed the HOA had acted responsibly. He claimed the issue was simply a misunderstanding. Then, the documentation started appearing: survey reports, property records, official boundary maps. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. The runway crossed land owned by my family. There was no debate. There was no uncertainty. The facts were clear. As the evidence spread throughout the community, residents became increasingly concerned. Many homeowners had contributed money to the project. Others had publicly supported it. Now, they wanted answers. They wanted to know how something so important could move forward without verifying basic property ownership. Community meetings became packed. Questions filled the room. Richard struggled to answer them. For years he had projected confidence. Now that confidence was disappearing, then came the meeting that changed everything. Experts reviewed the surveys. Attorneys reviewed the records. Officials reviewed the documentation. The conclusion was unanimous. The project could not continue in its current form. The runway crossed private property, and significant corrective action would be required. The room became silent. Several homeowners looked stunned. Others looked angry. Many could not believe the situation had progressed so far without anyone noticing the problem. What happened next shocked the entire neighborhood. The same project that Richard had promoted as his greatest achievement suddenly became his biggest liability. Costs began mounting. Engineering reviews were required. Legal reviews were required. Additional inspections were required. Every new report created more expenses. Every new question created more pressure. Residents who once supported the project began demanding accountability. The financial impact became impossible to ignore. What was supposed to be a proud community attraction had become a costly mistake. Months later, major changes swept through the HOA. New procedures were introduced. Project oversight increased. Documentation requirements became stricter. Residents demanded transparency before future projects could move forward. As for Richard, his reputation never recovered. The project that was supposed to secure his legacy ended up doing exactly the opposite. Looking back, the most surprising part was how avoidable everything had been. One phone call could have prevented the entire disaster. One property verification could have prevented months of problems. One simple check could have saved everyone enormous amounts of time and money. Instead, assumptions replaced facts, and assumptions turned into consequences. Today my farm remains exactly where it has always been. The fields have been restored. The property boundaries are respected. And the community has learned a lesson that nobody will soon forget. No matter how ambitious a project may be, it always pays to know whose land you are standing on. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments what you would have done after discovering a runway being built across your property. And do not forget to share this video and subscribe to Karen's Stories Daily for more HOA drama, entitled Neighbor Stories and Unbelievable Real-Life Conflicts.